Okay, so parents then and now really haven't changed with regards to how they care for their children. So if parents then and now haven't changed, what do you think has changed? Yes.
Not now, it's, I believe it's a law that we do in school.
Okay, now there are laws that require students to go to school. That's something new that wasn't there. But what about the parents? Do you think that your parents send you to school now because there's a law that requires them to send you to school? Otherwise you'd be kind of like, working out there in
No.
factories and stuff?
Wait, what?
What am I waiting for? She says that there is a law now that requires students to go to school up to a certain age, and she's right. But I don't think that she really means that her parents, if there was no law, would have her working, right? Your parents would still send you to school. So what has changed? The law has changed, and you're right, but what has changed? Yes.
They want us to have a good education.
They want you to have a good education, but I think that the parents back then, do you think the parents back then didn't want their kids to be educated? No, I want you to eat carbon when you grow up and be poor and have children, then have your children be poor. Do you think the parents were like that?
What's
No. So what has changed? Yes.
The economy,
Tell me about the economy.
before, like, those people didn't have that much money, and now they have like more.
I think that you got something there. What has changed is that people are wealthier now than they were then. And a couple of things, if you pay attention, a couple of things have changed in that period of time. I can pay attention closer because I've lived longer and I've seen more things. But I will tell you that today, it's unusual to find a family of 8 kids. Usually you have mom, dad, and 1 kid or 2 kids. 3 is a big family, 4 is really cool, but 8 kids, 9 kids, 10 kids is unusual. But during the turn of the century, 8, 9, 10 kids probably was very usual. And part of the reason was that everybody was so poor that the more people you could get out there to work, if you had 8 kids, you had 8 possible different jobs that they could have to bring in money for the family. As families have become wealthier, they don't have the need to have their kids working. They don't have the need to have so many kids actually bringing in money, and they've kind of shrunk a little bit. So the economy has changed. Now, those changes that we're talking about, that transformation, by the way, do you know the word transformation?
Yes.
If I use kind of a fancy word, you think you can understand it?
Yes.
Okay. Have you heard the word metamorphosis?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Science.
Metamorphosis is a scientific word that refers to a change. And what is the insect that we know that metamorphs? Yes.
Caterpillar.
Okay, caterpillar, it starts life as a what? A worm, right?
larva.
Kind of like, wormy. And then something happens.
A nymph.
Something happens, I don't know because I'm not a science teacher, but it begins to create a cocoon. And when the cocoon is ready, it opens up and what's inside doesn't look like what went in. And what's inside now is a beautiful butterfly. That's a metamorphosis. The society during this time of reform does kind of a metamorphosis. Before, kids worked very young. Before, the economy was very bad. Before, machines did not have to have any safety equipment. Employers were not required to look after their employees if they got injured. After. And after we're talking about now. Now, so we need to see, and what we're going to be doing is exploring that metamorphosis, what changed. Now, kids have to be in school until a certain age. If you're not, it violates the law. Now, we have more money. Now, machines have to have safety devices to protect us from getting hurt at work. Now, if you get hurt at work, your employer is responsible for taking care of you until you're better. Can't just replace you. So, what was inside that cocoon that went from what it was before to what it is now? That's what we're going to be looking at. And a couple of things. People began to be outraged. Okay, people began to be outraged because the wealthy people in society, their kids went to school. The wealthy people in society didn't see little kids getting their hands in the way of these machines and possibly losing limbs, if not fingers, from these machines. So, muckrackers disguised themselves, went in and started reporting on these horrible things that are happening. Remember, Reese was reporting on the horrible things that was happening inside these tenements. Well, other reporters were reporting, going into companies and kind of reporting on what was happening. And when the rich began to realize, the middle class began to realize, wow, this is terrible. We can't let this go on. This looks bad, number one. It's morally reprehensible. We can't allow it to continue. When people began to see through the reporters, through the articles, through the magazines, what was going on, they began to think that it was necessary to change things. Two, and then when people began to think that, they began to expect their politicians, their congressmen, senators, presidents, to make a change. They said, look, society right now is rotten. It's not really fair for the poor. Society is very fair for the rich, but the poor, which is most of us, it's not fair for. You guys need to do something about it. So, slowly, change began to seep through with politicians that began to say, we need to change things here. We need to do something to change the laws. At first, people began to try to change child labor laws and say, children below a certain age shouldn't be able to work. It isn't that they can't physically work. It isn't that they can't mentally work. It is that it is not fair for them to work while they can be preparing themselves to be and to do other better things. So people began to try to pass laws to put the minimum age of employment at a certain age. People began to say, employers, you have to be responsible for your employees. And the way that that happened was the formation of these groups of people that bound together, and one of the things that they did was go on strike. What are those groups of people called? And they're not strikers. They get together, they protest, but these organizations where they use strike as a tool are called what? No? People that bind together in organizations based on employees, and they go on strike, and the strike is not going to work, are called what? Unions. You're awesome! They're unions. Employees began to form unions. And the unions began to demand of the employer, if you want our labor, if you want our work, you're going to have to give us certain things that we want. Number one, we really would appreciate to keep all of our fingers. So we would really appreciate if your machines had some safety devices that would prevent us from getting injured. At the beginning, the employer said, hogwash. That's like Hogwarts, but different. Hogwash. Hogwash. But the employee said, we're firm on this. We're really not budging. And there were conflicts. And some of the conflicts were bloody. But when the smoke cleared, the employers realized that they needed to make some changes. And some of the changes that they agreed to was providing safer work environment. Now, I will tell you that the changes didn't come easily, because in this section, you're going to read again what you saw in the movie. And that was the story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. You remember that?
No.
The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was the factory where these women were working, and one of the things that had happened
Go for a fire.
was a fire took off.
Oh.
But fire sometimes is okay. I mean, nobody wants a fire, but if you've got the things in place, nobody gets injured. Did these people have the things in place?
No.
Okay, they didn't have sprinklers that automatically go off, and buildings like these have hidden sprinklers, so when the fire starts, they trigger and there's water that comes out to prevent it. This place didn't have sprinklers, but that's okay, because if the employees can get out of the building, worst could happen is you lose the stuff, and stuff can be replaced, people can. What prevented the people from getting out? Yes?
The fire escapes were blocked and they were broken.
Yeah, they had locked some of the doors. And the employers had locked some of the doors, probably thinking, I don't want to be robbed. And because there's a possibility that my employees are going to rob me, they're going to try to escape through different places, and therefore I'm going to lock them. So there was some of the exits were locked. Other of the exits were so narrow that would prevent lots of employees from going in at the same time. And they were narrow so that there would be somebody from the employer on the other side checking bags to make sure nobody was taking anything. And to make things worse, there was an open container of oil that was there. And oil and fire really don't mix very well. So when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory went, and by the way, the fire took a total amount of a half an hour. That's it. And I don't know if you've ever talked to your dad about fires, but in half an hour, a lot of things can happen. And in this fire, approximately 127 women lost their lives. Okay? And when that happened, it was front page news in the newspaper. And people began to read these newspapers and say, these employers are terrible. So public opinion with regards to the employers and the tactics that they were using begins to change. And as public opinion begins to change, politicians begin to say, if I want to get voted in, I better do something because the voters want change. So these politicians are the ones that are beginning to be called the progressive. And you see that there's a whole bunch of progressive presidents. And especially towards the last section, section number 4, we're going to meet some of them. And one of them, one of my favorite presidents, just because the teddy bear is named after him, was Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, and Theodore Roosevelt becomes one of the most active progressive presidents in U.S. history, and you're going to learn lots of stuff about Mr. Roosevelt. Any questions so far before we start reading? Yes?
There's no teddy bear named the Roosevelt.
His name was Theodore. They called him Teddy. And on one occasion, Theodore was a hunter, and he went to one of those parks where hunters go. And the owner of the park was so worried about the president being able to hunt that he caught a little baby cub, a bear cub, and tied him to a tree. And when the president arrived, of course, all of these reporters are there, because whenever the president's there, there's reporters, and he said, I'm not going to shoot that baby bear, that baby cub. So one of the reporters actually wrote a story about the President of the United States refusing to shoot a harmless cub. A woman